Good morning, third hour. This week, you guys are turning in the DBQ. That's due on Thursday. We talked about that in our chat, depending on when you're watching this last week. We're actually going to talk about it this morning. I'm recording this video Thursday. And then we're going to cover the last chapter for the year, which is chapter 27, the Cold War. Cold War begins almost immediately at the end of World War II as tensions exist between the United States and the Soviet Union over styles of government and freedom and choices, democracy versus communism. It's that age-old battle. Your questions on page 732, this is actually a pretty short chapter. It's only about 20 pages or so. Looking ahead, you choose one of three, like I always have you do. What made the tension between the U.S. and the Soviets evolve into the Cold War? Well, how did that tension lead into what's known as the Cold War? Again, difference between a cold and hot war is that Cold War has no bullets shot between the opposing countries. 2, the theory of containment. How did it drive U.S. foreign policy? Containment, again, is to not let communism spread. Contain it, keep it where it exists. We're not going to get it out of the Soviet Union, but don't let it spread anywhere else. That's containment. That's American foreign policy, 1945 up until 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I answered the first part of that question for you. And number 3, why the U.S. government and the American people believe there was a threat of internal communist subversion. Why do we believe they're communists all over? Okay, answer one of those 3. Back of the chapter, call and reflect, there's only 4 questions. 752, how did American diplomats plan for the post-war world and settle the issues? Incorporate the UN, the United Nations, into that answer. How did opposing visions of the post-war world thwart those efforts? That's where communism comes in. How do post-war economic problems affect politics and society? We enter a recession after World War II because now we're back to peacetime economy and you have to convert your economy. Number 3, why the U.S. become involved in the war in Korea. Korea is split at the 38th parallel. North Korea is communist, South Korea is democratic. North Korea is backed by the Soviet Union, South Korea is backed by the United States. North Korea invades South Korea in June of 1950. That's what originally brought us into the Korean War. We're trying to drive the North Koreans out of South Korea. Later in 1950, Douglas MacArthur, who headed UN forces, begins pushing the North Koreans back into North Korea. He decides that he's just going to try to drive them off the Korean Peninsula. China comes in at that point. Korean War lasts until 1953, and it's a stalemate. Nothing changes. Number 4, why the fear of communism at home reached such great proportions. And our discussion board question is kind of based on that too. Discussion board for the week is off of 751 on this little debating the past McCarthyism, which is what we're going to talk about in our chat this week. Discussion board is why the American public feels so threatened by communism. Why is it such a problem? Again, our fear of communism frames the entire Cold War. And then who exploited those fears. So our discussion board I've uploaded is a section from a speech that Republican Senator of Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, gives in West Virginia in 1950, claiming I hold here in my hand, the names of 205 communists who work at the government. He didn't have those names, but we're going to talk about this fear of communism that becomes known as McCarthyism, which is just labeling anyone that you don't like or disagrees with you a communist. He labeled, the fellow members of the government communists. He said the army was full of communists. Everyone's communist. We're going to look at how that phenomenon actually occurred. The chapter itself goes through origins of the war, even before World War II ends at Yalta, covered on page 734, the picture of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And then collapse of the peace. There's the Potsdam issue. That's negotiations at the end of World War II in Germany, United States, Britain, Soviet Union. How are they going to divide up in Berlin? And Germany is a big piece to this. If you remember from 4L that they split Germany into zones of occupation amongst the Allied nations. And the United States and Britain and France put their zones together, and it becomes West Germany. The Soviets don't just keep their zones separate. That's East Germany, and you've got Berlin and East Germany, and Berlin as the capital city is split into four as well. It's just very messy circumstances for Germany and for Europe after World War II. Talks about the Marshall Plan on 737. That's the U.S. rebuilding Western Europe. Okay, and there's a political cartoon that shows it on 738. Where else are we going? China becomes communist in late 1940, 48, 49. The communists in Mao Zedong defeat the nationalists, who are led by Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists go to Taiwan, and we recognize Taiwan as a legitimate government of China. And then we've got, American Society after politics on politics after the war on 741. The famous picture of my man Harry Truman, 743, Dewey defeats Truman. Truman was not expected to win re-election in 48, and so much so that newspapers were printing up that he had already lost before the election was over. And that's a famous picture of Truman holding up that sign from the Chicago Tribune. Anyway, Truman had a plan called the Fair Deal that advocated for fair housing and national health insurance. Most of that's rejected by Republicans in Congress. We get into the Korean War on 745, and then HWAC, which is the 747 HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. They find communists that had worked in the government, some, or in the State Department, Alger Hiss, who actually perjured himself, and this starts us down this path of McCarthyism and going into Hollywood and blacklisting people and saying that they can't work in pictures and whatnot for being communists. And then Eisenhower wins the 1952 election. Eisenhower is the first Republican to win a presidential election since Herbert Hoover in 1928. So it had been 20 years. FDR is elected to 4 terms. Then Truman comes in, is elected to his own term. So Cold War, this is the last chapter. We'll talk about finals this week, what those are going to look like. It's probably going to be a hybrid of multiple choice and short answer questions. 10% of your grade, they are being graded like normal. So not the A minus thing. So if you bomb your final, you're putting yourself in a bad situation. Any questions you have this week, let me know. Get the DBQ in. You need to get missing work in if you're missing anything. We're having book collection on June 4th. So, we're going to give you a cutoff date soon. I need your stuff. Take care of yourself. Have a good week.